we're gonna have to finish a little early today at about 3:45 because of the limitations. Venerable Namdring is teaching a course at 4, and we only have one computer and one internet connection, and we're in the same room. So we'll have to make do. But tomorrow we can have the full sessions because Venerable Namdring is only teaching today. So we'll just finish about 15 minutes early. So maybe we can get started now. Then Shanti, are you there? If you could lead the prayers, and then we'll start with the actual talk. Okay. This ground anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, the 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. Thus may all living beings enjoy this pure land. O holy and perfect pure Lama, from the clouds of compassion that form in the skies of your Dharmakaya wisdom, please release rain the vast and profound Dharma, precisely in accordance with the needs of those to be trained. Idam Gurana Mandala Kamniriyatayami. Okay, everybody. So for those of you who have come back, welcome back. Hopefully others will trickle in slowly. Now, as we mentioned in the morning session, we can ask everyone to please turn off their video and audio because of the difficult connection. But feel free at any time to send messages in the chat if you're confused by something I said, if you can't hear me, or just to let me know you're following what I'm saying and you find it helpful, because I can't see your faces, and so it's useful to get an idea of where people are at and make sure I'm not just talking over everybody's heads. So this morning we talked about the introduction about the 60 stanzas on reasoning. I mentioned this is one of the sixfold collection of reasoning, one of Nagarjuna's 6 main texts at Emptiness. But that unlike the last text I taught, the 70 stanzas in Emptiness, this text is more about why it's important to realize emptiness as opposed to explicitly describing what emptiness is. Now, I will also mention, because one of you asked, what is emptiness? Because that's obviously important to understand, even if our main subject is not emptiness. And as I said, if you really want to learn more about it in depth, I would suggest you can watch the video of my last course because it's not something I can say very quickly. But the definition I gave, I think I might have gotten cut off, was that emptiness in this, at least in the Madhyamaka Prasangika school, it's understood as when you search among the designation, basis of designation of something, you cannot find anything that is that thing or is the referent for the term. So that's a bit of a weighty phrase, but we could say, for example, I would say I'm Tenzin Gache, and conventionally that's correct. But if you search, is my body Tenzin Gache? Is my mind Tenzin Gache? If my body is Tenzin Gache, is it my right arm, my left arm? Is it a collection of all the parts? Is it, if it's my mind, is it today's mind, tomorrow's mind, the continuity of mind? Is it the happy mind, the sad mind? And if any of these were the person, if there's any of these were Tenzin Gache, then we have to look at how we use language. So we would say, okay, well, my body is Tenzin Gache. But then, if I say that my hand hurts, right? So it sounds like my hand is something that I possess, mine, or my body, I say. So if my body was the same as me, it wouldn't make any sense to talk about my body, because that would be the exact same thing. There can't be something that possesses itself. The way we conceive of it is that it's something different. But at the same time, when my body is in pain, sometimes they say I'm in pain. So we also see that we don't conceive of them as substantially different things. It's not like I'm something up in the sky that's like a puppeteer controlling my body. And likewise with my mind, I'd say I'm sad, as if that's my mind. But I can also get, we'd say gain a little some space or objectivity, and I can say, there's sadness arising in my mind, or my mind is really distracted right now, as though it's something different that I am possessing it. And likewise, I say, yesterday I was sad, today I'm happy. So then there's a question, well, am I both people? Am I the person who was sad yesterday or the person who's happy today? or am I a collection of both of them? But if I'm a collection of both of them, then am I both happy and sad? But how can something be both happy and sad? Or if I was 10 years old before, now I'm 30 years old, then something can't be both 10 years old and 30 years old. So is it one person that's both of them? Or is it a collection of both of them? So the point here is that anytime we talk about anything, it's not just a person. What we have a particular convention that we use that's useful, but when we actually try to define what it is, then we run into all kinds of problems. And the understanding of emptiness is that ultimately we can't find anything. We can talk about it conventionally. It's conventionally correct to say I'm a man, and it's conventionally wrong to say I'm a woman. But if you try to then pinpoint exactly what I am, you can never find it. It exists in dependence on causes and conditions that are not itself. It exists in dependence on parts that are not itself. And it exists in dependence on the use of terms, language, and conceptual thought. Without conceptual thought, it doesn't exist. So this is a difficult concept. This is why I said it's something that I spent the entire course talking about last time, and it's something that we are spending 4 years studying in depth, and 4 years is not enough, because it's important not just as a concept, as I mentioned this morning. Nagarjuna talks about this is an urgent matter. He talks about a person on fire, and he wants to. It's like as much as you'd want to put out the fire when your clothes are on fire, you want to put out the suffering of ignorance, because that's causing all of the other sufferings. So it's something we want to recognize. And Nagarjuna and Buddhist philosophers are saying that it's this misconception that when I talk about something, that it refers to something concrete and real that does not depend upon my concept of it. This is actually what causes suffering and what causes me to be born and to experience a life as a limited sentient being. If I could be free of that, I would no longer experience birth under the power of karma. So what I talked about this morning was then, if Nagarjuna is saying this is the only way to be free, the question is, who is getting free of this? Is it only people who have this philosophy of emptiness? And Nagarjuna's point is that it's best to have the philosophy because it's like a roadmap. But ultimately, what it is that somebody understands this concept intuitively. The Gache is saying that we will negate the tenets of the Hinayana schools, but that doesn't mean that Hinayana practitioners don't necessarily realize emptiness. There might be practitioners who understand it. The people writing the books might not be the ones who understand it. But it's best to have both the intellectual understanding and the experiential understanding, because with the intellectual understanding, it's much easier to explain it to others, first of all. And secondly, it's understood that for the Mahayana realization of Buddhahood, both are necessary. Merely experience is not enough to bring us to full enlightenment. We also have to be able to conceptualize about it and to understand things from many different points of view. So then the question I asked, this is in case you were wondering why I had all these presentations of other religions. My question was that, and I don't have an answer to this question, but I think it's an important question, is that if we say that even though the Hinayana tenets are wrong, that still Hinayana practitioners, through the force of their merit, can achieve liberation, well then could we say that philosophically other religions have flaws, but that people who practice those religions sincerely, not just practice like they go to church on Sunday, but practice in full meditation retreat for many years, might actually have some kind of realization? And it seems to me from some of the people I presented that there's a lot of evidence for that. I don't have an answer, but especially of the people I mentioned, I would say especially the Christian Saint Therapam and the Vedic scholar, Advaita Vedanta scholar, Adi Shankara, it definitely seems something was going on. So I think the point I'm trying to make is that, we might want to reject their philosophies, but we have to be very careful, not to come into the view that we have the right view and everyone else is wrong. Because as we saw also, there are many Buddhist themselves who don't realize emptiness. Chandrakirti himself specifically mentioned, Vasubandhu and Dignaga and Dharmapala. It might be a little bit politically incorrect to just name people, but it's also helpful for us to recognize that these extraordinary scholars had still not realized the profound view, according to Chandrakirti. This also segues a bit. Somebody just sent me a message during the break time asking, or just sort of mentioning that they had experienced a lot of corruption and hypocrisy within the Thai tradition, actually. So I want to mention, that's not surprising to me, unfortunately. I'm also part of the Tibetan tradition, and I can unfortunately say, after being in the monastery for 15 years, I've seen the good and the bad of the Tibetan culture. But this is the exact same point, that just because some people in this culture might have deep realization, it doesn't mean that the entire culture is enlightened. Sometimes some of us might, like for myself, grow up in a Western culture and feel disillusioned with the culture because we see so many problems. So then we might think, okay, well, Tibetans seem so much better. So then we expect that everything's going to be enlightened in the society, but we'll be very disillusioned if we have that idea. But I think, we have to be very critical about every detail. If we have very general ideas, oh, this is good, this is bad, we don't see the forest for the trees, I guess we could say. Or actually, we see the trees for the forest is a better way to put this particular point. We don't see every particular detail. So I think it's like if somebody looks at Western culture and sees all these extraordinary scientific achievements that people have accumulated, but then you go to a great academy of science and you find that people are mean and treat each other without compassion. And a lot of scientists are closed-minded. That's just human nature. That does not negate that certain scientists have extraordinary minds. And some of them are extraordinary human beings. They're not just intellectuals. Some scientists, as a result of their reflections, have really become very compassionate people. But we can't expect the entire institution, unfortunately, to abide by those realizations or those insights. And likewise within Buddhism, we don't want to have the naive view that all the different Buddhist practitioners or all the monastics are enlightened people. But we also don't want to get turned off from it, just because some people might have normal afflictions that human beings have. There might also be something very extraordinary here. And this is what we're trying to discover. So we'll come back now to the presentation. So in the morning, we reached slide 25, which I was talking about East Asian masters. And then, as we just mentioned about Thai masters, now here we come to Southeast Asian masters in slide 26. So remember that, K. Dripje was saying that the Hinayana tenets, the tenets of the schools like the Sautrantika, the Sutra followers, and the Vaibhashika school, are rejected by the Madhyamaka school. But that doesn't mean that real practitioners of the Hinayana teachings, which were taught by the Buddha, do not achieve realization. And so here we have some examples from the 20th century of Southeast Asian masters who are following the Pali Sutras, who it definitely seems to me achieved realization. So in the center, we have Ajahn Mun, some of you might know, was probably the most famous Thai master of the 20th century, and explicitly told his students, not everyone, he didn't announce it, but he did say he was an arhat, he had achieved liberation. And he also, in his biography, it details that at one point in his life, he had a dream that two of his students would also become arhats. It does not mention in the biography who they are, but it seems that a lot of people believe that it was these two students of his, Ajahn Bua and Ajahn Chah, who also achieved arhatship. Ajahn Mun's biography, I would highly recommend. It was actually written by Ajahn Bua, which is probably why he did not specify who it was that was in the dream, because he didn't want to glorify himself. But Ajahn Mun's biography has a lot of points that we might read about in ancient sutras about somebody had such and such experience and think, oh, this is just something that was fantasy in ancient India. But it's something that was happening in the 20th century. This great master who went into the forest and had a lot of extraordinary experiences, both with non-human beings, with gods, but also realization of his own mind, of freedom from afflictions. And something also that I think is very interesting in his story is that at a certain point during his meditation practice, he remembered his past life and remembered that he had taken the bodhisattva vow in the past. And then he decided that he wanted to give up the bodhisattva vow because he decided that he recognized if he aspired for arhatship, the lower level of enlightenment, he could achieve it in this life. Whereas if he continued on the bodhisattva path, it would take a very long time. And he wanted to achieve it very, very soon. He could feel it was very close. So this is very interesting because it shows that this is not just a philosophical concept, this idea that there's a distinction between Mahayana practice for full enlightenment and what we call Hinayana practice, practicing for self-liberation. Here's a person who explicitly said that he chose one over the other. Now, as I said, in Nagarjuna's philosophy, and especially in Chandrakirti's understanding, both the Hinayana and the Mahayana practitioners realize emptiness. It's simply a matter of the degree to which they cultivate that realization. Somebody who cultivates it for less time, with less speculation, less thinking about it from less different points of view, and only in a very narrow way, will achieve the self-liberation that Ajahn Mun achieved. But somebody who is willing to take much longer and accumulate a lot more merit and think about it from many different points of view can achieve a higher level of enlightenment. But in any case, it's still quite extraordinary that somebody could practice in this way. And as I say, I will send out a book list at the end of the course. So I will mention the name of his biography, which is really worth reading. And then we have Mahasi Sayadaw, you see here on the right, one of the great Burmese masters. He was a student of Lady Sayadaw, who was in the 19th century, a great revivalist of practice within the Burmese tradition. And then Mahasi Sayadaw, again, he definitely he studied philosophy, but he was much more involved in practice. And so I think this is also interesting to see that we have a very large book by his called The Manual of Insight that was published a few years ago in English. I haven't read through the whole book myself. I looked through some parts of it. But Geshe Tenzin Namdok, the senior Western monk, Western Geshe, did read the entire book and gave me some interesting comments on it. He said he felt that it definitely seemed that Mahasi Sayadaw had realized emptiness, not through philosophical speculation, but simply through meditating on dependent arising within his body, within the arising of sensations in the body, which I think very much is in accord with the Kajripche's understanding that somebody might not philosophically come to this understanding, but through intensive practice, a lot of insight and a lot of merit, they could still have this realization. And then Mahasi Sayadaw, one of his famous students was the Bangladeshi master, Anigarika Munindra. And then Munindra's student was on the left here. We have Dipa Ma. So it was actually from Calcutta, as an Indian woman who moved with her husband to Burma. And then her husband died, and she fell into quite difficult circumstances, taking care of her daughter Dipa. The word Dipa Ma means the mother of Dipa. This is how she was known. And Dipa Ma, at about age 40, in desperation, she attended a meditation course. We had these 10-day Vipassana retreats, something like that in Burma. And it said that within 6 days of the course, she achieved stream entry, which means achieve the direct perception of emptiness. So I think if any of you have done a 10-day Vipassana course, you know that it's a bit difficult the first time, and it's probably quite unusual to achieve the direct perception of emptiness on your first Vipassana course. But this shows that this person had extraordinary imprints from the past, and also shows that it's possible through these practices to realize emptiness. It's not just something that has to come from philosophy, especially when we're practicing the Hinayana path. And Dipa Ma also, showed a lot of miraculous powers in her lifetime. Her teacher Munindra actually encouraged her to cultivate these, saying that it would be beneficial to others. So for example, there was one case where I think they had a professor sit in one room, one place, and somebody else go to another place, and they both reported that she came to meet them at the same time, meaning that she somehow had managed to double her body. And other things like this you can read about in her biography, which I can also send out. So it's definitely clear that in Southeast Asia, there was an authentic strand of the Buddhist teachings being practiced, and people realizing emptiness, just as Chandrakirti says must happen if people practice the teachings from the first wheel of the teaching. Next, we have Tibetan masters. And when I say Tibetan masters, what I'm presenting here is masters who are not in the Gelug school. Because again, the Gelug school understands itself, at least from its own side, to be the correct philosophy. So then the question is, if it was, and if we were to take that standpoint, well, then are people who oppose that philosophy thereby not achieving liberation? And again, I think that's too difficult. That's too narrow of a view. I had Lama Zopa Rinpoche mentioning this morning that even though, in his opinion, before Tsongkhapa, there was not a correct philosophical presentation of emptiness in Tibet, there were still people who realized emptiness based on their merit. And here we have, you see, Dolpopa Sherab Kelston on the left, who lived just before Tsongkhapa. I think he died just about 5 years before Tsongkhapa was born. And Dolpopa, or also known as Jonangpa, he founded the Jonangpa school, had a philosophy that was almost diametrically opposed to Tsongkhapa in terms of his understanding of emptiness. And a lot of Tsongkhapa's books are explicitly negating this philosophy. Yet at the same time, Tsongkhapa seems to revere him as a great master, and he's still revered. The Jonangpa school has not ever grown to a very large size, but it has influenced Kagyu and Nyingma schools significantly. It was persecuted quite a bit in Tibet. But again, as I said, we have to see that culturally, like most traditional cultures, Tibet was a bit of a rigid culture. And what we take for granted today about egalitarianism and appreciating other traditions was not always the case in other cultures in the past. But I think today we can look at this person, and even though philosophically, as a Gelug scholar and somebody who debates, I would debate against him for the purpose of debating and understanding, still it's clear that something was extraordinary was happening in this person's life. And likewise with Rangton Shecha Kunrik, who lived at the same time as Tsongkhapa and was his opponent. And even in the Gelug school, he's understood to be an emanation of Maitreya. It said that the story goes that when Kedrup J, Tsongkhapa's student, came to debate with him, out of fear of being defeated in the debate, I don't know if this really happened, but anyway, he absorbed into the statue of Maitreya. And then Kedrup J was looking for him, and he looked at the statue, and the statue started sweating. So he knew he was in the statue. But then this is understood that he was really a manifestation of Maitreya, and he was only appearing in this way to challenge Tsongkhapa as a way of clarifying the view. But in any case, again, he is renowned as a great scholar among the Sakya lineage. And likewise, we have Gorampa Sonam Senge, who is probably the most important of the Sakya scholars. He's for the Sakya, almost like Tsongkhapa is for the Gelug, who explicitly negated Tsongkhapa. He had, I think, 25 points of negation of his philosophy. And all Sakya practitioners, or at least in the Sakya colleges, they study his textbooks. So it seems that His Holiness the Dalai Lama himself has said of these practitioners, it seems that some people, he says, Holiness says, although I don't personally find this philosophy satisfying, it seems that some people meditate on this and achieve some kind of realization. So, there seems that maybe there's other ways to approach the same ultimate understanding. I don't know. But we can see that, we have to be careful and keep an open mind about these things. So next, I want to ask this question about one Dharma. So you might know Joseph Goldstein is a very famous Buddhist teacher in America. was a student of Nagarjuna Muninjar, who I mentioned before, the student who was a student of Mahasi Sayadaw. And Joseph Goldstein wrote this book about, I think, 20 years ago, called One Dharma, in which he was looking at the different Buddhist traditions, in East Asia and Southeast Asia and Tibet, and asking, are they really so diametrically opposed? When they seem to be talking about different things, are they really talking about the same thing, the same realization? So I really don't have an answer to that. I think it's too simplistic just to say it's all the same. I said that this morning. He seems to want to say that Dzogchen is essentially the same as Vipassana. And I think that's probably not true. Dzogchen is talking about manifesting the subtle clear light consciousness, which is not talked about in Vipassana. However, according to Chandrakirti's understanding, the realization of emptiness is essentially the same, even though the words might be different. If people are really realizing emptiness, it should be the same. So this is just an open question, whether these are different ways of talking about the same thing or they're talking about different things. I really don't know. But next we have the question, was the Buddha superior? And what I mean by that is, the question is, we have the traditional Buddhist teachings, we say the early Buddhist teachings, which all Buddhists agree were taught by the Buddha. So the Mahayana Sutras are separated here. I'll talk about those in a minute, because at least in Southeast Asia, those are not accepted as the word of the Buddha. But in all Buddhist cultures, these early Buddhist teachings are accepted as the word of the Buddha. So then the question is, in those traditional teachings, is it clear that the Buddha is different than the Arhats? Because if it is, then it shows that there is some kind of higher realization, that there's a difference between Mahayana practice aiming for full Buddhahood and Hinayana practice aiming for self-liberation. And I think actually it's very clear in those teachings. So we have here in the center the picture of Moggallana, who was one of the Buddha's greatest disciples. But there are many examples in the sutras where Moggallana has to ask the Buddha to check something because he can't see it himself, and that the Buddha is explicitly stated to have a higher realization, and therefore he can see something Moggallana cannot see. So here we have Moggallana offering food to a hungry ghost, because Moggallana was known for having visions of hungry ghosts and hell beings and traveling to different realms with his psychic powers. But when Moggallana's mother died, he used his psychic powers to look for her and he couldn't find her anywhere. So he had asked the Buddha, who had greater realization, to look for where his mother was. So this then opens the question, well, if the Buddha's realization was superior, then how did he get a different realization? And why didn't, if we don't accept the Mahayana teachings, then why would he not have taught the way to get there? And likewise, we have two very important quotes from the Hinayana, from the Pali Canon, really, the Hinayana Sutras, which are used. The one on the left is used by the Pali teachers to try to negate the Mahayana Sutras as being taught by the Buddha. So we have the Buddha saying just before he passes away, I have taught the Dhamma Ananda, making no inner and outer. That Tathagata has no teacher's fist in respect to the doctrine, meaning I haven't held anything back. Everything I've taught, everything I know, I've taught to you. But actually, there's a lot of speculation that this passage was added later. So we have to be very careful and critical and look at these things carefully. It's possible that this was not taught by the Buddha, or it's possible that he taught it and it was only intended for particular people, or it's possible that that's the truth and that he didn't actually have anything else to say. And then on the right side, we have a teaching where the Buddha talked about the sala trees, sala leaves. So the Buddha, he held up a handful of leaves and he said, which are more numerous, the leaves in my hand or the leaves in the forest? And they said the leaves in the forest. And the Buddha said, likewise, what I've revealed to you is only like the leaves in my hand. What I actually understand is like the leaves in the forest, implying that he had a much greater realization than simply what he taught explicitly. So this leaves open the question, was there something more to what he was teaching other than what appears in the early Buddhist sutras? Likewise, we have the question of whether the Buddha taught emptiness. in the early sutras, in the Pali Canon. As I said many times, Chandrakirti is very explicit about this, that in the Pali Canon, yes, the Buddha taught emptiness. If he hadn't, no one could have achieved arhatship, because even to achieve arhatship, you have to realize emptiness. So I won't read these quotes. You'll have them, and you can read them later. But basically, there are two quotes that the top one is often cited by modern scholars as an example of the teaching of emptiness in the Pali Canon. And the bottom one, actually, it's explicitly mentioned by Nagarjuna in the Root Wisdom. He quotes this text, a text from the Pali Canon, implying that there's a middle between extremes, showing that the Buddha taught this middle way, the emptiness, within the Pali Canon. The difference is that he didn't teach it extensively. He only taught it in a fairly basic manner, such that people could achieve Hinayana arhatship, but not enough that they could achieve full Buddhahood. So then we have the bigger question, and then the Buddha teaches the Mahayana Sutras. So we have here in the top left, the Vulture's Peak in Rajagira, which is, again, it's very, very close to Nalanda. Some of you might have visited near Bodh Gaya. And a lot of the Mahayana Sutras, such as the Heart Sutra, were said to be taught there. And just below that, I have a picture. This is actually the 8,000 verse Perfection and Wisdom Sutra, which again was said to have been taught at Vulture's Peak. So there's a question, did the Buddha really go there and teach these sutras? Now, as many of you know, when you read the Heart Sutra, it will say there's a great community of bodhisattvas. And in the 8,000 Perfection and Wisdom Sutra, it says, there was like 10,000 bodhisattvas there. But you see, it's a very small place. So if it was taught, it had to have been taught in some mystical manner. There's something, either it was misreported, either it was, or it was not taught by the Buddha and it was written later, or it's something that's, it was taught in some way beyond our ordinary comprehension, that all these people could fit into this space, or maybe they were hovering in the sky, because it's quite a large expanse around that, as you can see. And on the right, we have Nagarjuna, who claims that he recovered a lot of these sutras that were taught, that had been lost. Now, in his text, The Precious Garland, the Nagarjuna explicitly argues, saying that the Buddha taught the Mahayana Sutras. So it's clear that even at the time of Nagarjuna, there were people arguing that these were not the word of the Buddha. And again, I think we have to approach this very skeptically. And skeptically doesn't mean cynically. It means that we don't just accept these things. This is the tradition of Nalanda, that we critically examine things. And so I'd have to say, Nagarjuna makes a number of arguments. I grouped them into basically 4 arguments. And I think 2 of them I don't find very convincing, but 2 of them are quite intriguing. And the 2 I don't find very convincing. The first one seems to be essentially that people who say the Buddha didn't teach the Mahayana Sutras are ignorant and angry people. But honestly, I think that that does not hold weight in a philosophical argument. This is the argument against the person. We have to, even if somebody is ignorant and angry, it has no bearing on whether what they're saying is true or not. We have to examine the evidence for it. I think maybe it's the case that at the time of the Nagarjuna, there were specific people who, out of anger, were saying these things. I don't know. But even if these people were angry, we have to examine the veracity of what they're saying. And then the second thing Nagarjuna says is that look at how wonderful the teachings are in the Mahayana Sutras, about love and compassion and the perfections. And how could the Buddha not have taught this? It's so great. But again, I think this doesn't necessarily prove that the Buddha taught it. However, 2 arguments he does make that I find more convincing. One is that he argues quite convincingly that when the Buddha was talking about certain things in the Pali Sutras, in the Hinayana Sutras, such as what he called non-extinction, he was actually talking about emptiness. So when you argue that the emptiness is not the teaching of the Buddha, that's misunderstanding of the Hinayana Sutras. That actually, Nagarjuna says, when we talk about non-production in the Mahayana Sutras, it's the same meaning as when the Buddha talked about extinction in the Hinayana Sutras, because when he talked about extinction, he wasn't talking about a flame going out. And then this, we talk about nirvana, and this will be a major topic as we get into the 60 stanzas. It's not talking about something that once existed, thereby being put out of existence. It's talking about lack of inherent existence, natural extinction. Things by their own nature are already extinct of inherent existence. So this we'll talk about a lot within the teaching itself. And then second, another argument I think is quite convincing is he says that, and this is what I alluded to before, if the Buddha in the Hinayana Sutras, he didn't actually teach how to become a Buddha. It was clear that his realization was higher than the realization of his Arhat disciples. Yet there's no indication in the Hinayana Sutras of how to become like the Buddha. Why would he not teach that? So why would he not have taught that somewhere else? And now to the right of Nagarjuna, we have some modern scholars. We have T.W. Rhys David, who was an early translator of the Pali Sutras. And just as a representation, it's not just him himself, but a representative of the early translators, most of whom rejected the Mahayana Sutras and said this is extraneous. They only really took the Pali Canon seriously. This was in the early 20th century, and this was pretty much the dominant paradigm at the time. Now later we had Edward Conzi, who was translating in the 1950s, who was one of the first Western scholars to really take the Mahayana Sutras seriously, and to ask, what reason do we have to believe that Buddha didn't teach this? Can we really ask these questions and look at these and not just dismiss them? And then to the right of that, we have Nyaya Tiloka, who I admire greatly. He was the first Western Buddhist monk of the modern time. Now I say modern time because actually in ancient times, some of you might not know this, there were Greeks who became Buddhist monks. It's recorded in some of the ancient histories of early Buddhist Sangha. But it was obviously a large gap. And then Nyaya Tiloka became a monk in 1903. He was a German man. He was the first Westerner in the modern times to become a bhikshu. But in Nyaya Tiloka, he ordained, as I mentioned, 1903, and until he died in 1957. So he was a monk for 54 years. He was a Mahatera, a great elder. And he was the first Westerner, again, in modern times. It's not certain whether this happened in ancient times, but certainly the first in modern times to attend a Buddhist council. There was the 6th Buddhist council of the Pali scholars in Burma in 1955, I believe. So just before he died, he attended this. And one thing he stated in this council was that he considered that the Mahayana Sutra was not the teachings of the Buddha, that when we talk about Buddhism, we're talking about the Theravada, and we shouldn't consider the other ones as the teachings of the Buddha. So it's clear that a lot of serious practitioners still hold this view. And I guess I say, I don't by any means disrespect this view, because I think there's a lot of, if we look historically at it, it's very hard to historically verify that the Buddha taught the Mahayana Sutras. We really have to start to have the possibility that they exist in some mystical way, because historically the evidence seems to be weighted towards these not being something that were historical documents from the time and place where they were said to have arisen. But it's possible things could exist in a different way than appears to our ordinary way of seeing things. And that's not something I would say if we didn't have reason to take it seriously. But here we have His Holiness the Dalai Lama on the bottom. And His Holiness is very serious about this. And that's something I take very seriously, because I think not only is His Holiness a great scholar, but also somebody who has a lot of realization and has indicated, he does not often do this in public, but I've heard indications. For example, one time somebody asked him about his recollection of his past lives, and it seems that this particular person was a little skeptical. So His Holiness, in a small group gathering of people, then seemed to indicate he had some recollection of having been born as a student of the Buddha in the historical times. And that's something I take seriously as a practitioner, as a follower of His Holiness. somebody has such a recollection, there might be a lot of things happening, because even nowadays, a lot of these great masters, they don't always explicitly talk about everything, just with this Holiness talking about this particular thing. So it's possible that the Buddha taught these things to specific disciples who were ready for them, and it wasn't part of the explicit teaching. But again, like a lot of the things I've talked to up until now, I'll leave this as an open question, and it's something that all of us can think about. So finally, this is the last slide of the opening presentation. Then the question is, did the Buddha teach emptiness in the first turning of the wheel? And by the first turning of the wheel, what I mean is we say the Dhammachakra Sutra, where the Buddha first taught the 5 disciples in Sarnath, the four Noble Truths, but then also all of the other thematically related sutras. So most of the Pali Canon, sutras about the 12 links, the dependent ordination, and so forth. And this was a debate in ancient India among Mahayana teachers who accepted the second turning of the wheel, being the perfection of wisdom sutras. It's, did the Buddha teach emptiness in the first turn of the wheel, or was it only something exclusive to the perfection of wisdom sutras? So on the left, we have Bhavaviveka, a great scholar. You'll see on the right, Chandrakirti. And so you see their hands in the air. They're not waving to each other. They're debating. But you see from their smiles and their faces that they were also very good-natured people. They debated with each other, but they also had a lot of respect for each other. And they're both people that we revere as great scholars, even though we ultimately follow Chandrakirti's system. Just incidentally, in the Tibetan tradition, Bhavaviveka was considered, actually, I don't know how they would determine this, but it's understood that he later reincarnated as Sakya Pandita, the Tibetan scholar, who later reincarnated as Kedrupje, the student of Tsongkhapa, and that Kedrupje was unable to comprehend Tsongkhapa's teaching on Mahamudra, but he did, unlike most of the students, recognize that something was happening when Tsongkhapa gave the Mahamudra transmission to his student, Tokten Jompo Gyaltso. And then later, in another subsequent future life, Kedrupje was reborn as Gawa Nsapa, the great solitary practitioner who then said to achieve enlightenment. So eventually he got there. Eventually he realized the truth. And then Gawa Nsapa was reincarnated as Losang Chökyi Gyaltsen, who is generally recognized as the first Panchen Lama. So this is actually the lineage of the Panchen Lamas. So in any case, it takes a long time, but when people sincerely apply themselves to these things, it may be eventually they will have the realization. So Bhavaviveka, he argues 3 reasons why he thinks the emptiness was not taught in the first turning of the wheel. First, hearers and solitary realizers do not need to realize emptiness, because his understanding is that to achieve self-liberation, you only need to realize what we call selflessness of person. You do not need to realize emptiness of phenomena or selflessness of phenomena. So there's no need to teach emptiness. And secondly, if the Buddha taught emptiness in the first wheel, then the second wheel would be redundant. The whole point of the second turning of the wheel was to teach emptiness. And that third, when the Buddha said selflessness, all things are selfless, he was talking about a person. He was saying there's no self-sufficient person. So when the Buddha, even in his very first teaching, the Four Noble Truths, he said that this suffering is selfless. He was talking about it doesn't belong to a substantial self, a substantial person. But Chandrakirti objects to all 3 of these points by saying, everybody must realize emptiness to achieve liberation, regardless of whether they achieve the lower Hinayana liberation or the higher realization of enlightenment. They need to realize emptiness. And secondly, the second wheel was not redundant, because although the emptiness was taught in the first wheel, in the second wheel it was taught extensively, and not just in a very, a condensed way, because it's necessary to realize emptiness in a much broader way to achieve full enlightenment. And also the Bodhisattva deeds were taught in the second wheel, which were not taught in the first wheel. So it was specifically taught how to become a full Buddha. And third, when the Buddha said all things are selfless, this is an important point. The self he was talking about does not mean a person. It's talking about a nature that doesn't depend on anything else. So in that sense, it's the same for a person or a chair or a table or a horse or a house or mind or any phenomenon is selfless in the sense that it does not have a nature that depends on something else. So everything, it lacks inherent existence. And this is what is meant by selflessness. I don't know if you can see in the corner of this picture, behind Chandrakirti, there's a little picture of a cow on the wall. This is just a famous story that Chandrakirti, in order to dispel his disciples grasping at inherent existence, he drew a picture of a cow on the wall and then he milked the cow and then milk came out. So it shows, I don't know if, where these stories come from, but there's an understanding that when people have really realized emptiness, then they experience things as like a dream. It's like waking up in a dream, and then you can control your dream. So now we have the actual text, the 60 stanzas. So it's about 3 o'clock. We've only got about 45 minutes in this session, but I'll get through what I can. As I mentioned, this text, I'm going to go through every verse if I can, because it's a little easier than 70 stanzas where I couldn't just go through every verse, it was too dense. But I'll try to go through verse by verse and give an idea of what's being talked about. Let me just read the chat briefly and see if there's anything. Okay, so if anybody, just take a pause for a second. If anybody is having any technical problems with the sound, or if anyone is confused by anything I've said, please let me know briefly. Otherwise, I'll move on to the text. Good. Yeah, it seems like the connection is better this afternoon, and I can even leave the video on because we're going through the slides ourselves. So there's some other questions here, but maybe I'll leave these for the end of the session, unless there's anything problematic right now. But at the end of the session, if we have some time, and if not, I'll address them tomorrow. And if not, then of course I can do it via email later on. Okay, so I'll come back to the presentation here. So with this 60 stanzas, I sent out also the translation. So I actually translated the text myself, because as I said in the last talk, I like to translate the texts which are written in poetry into English poetry. I think that's important. It's a feature that's often lost in translation. These were traditionally what they called sholakas in Sanskrit, which were, I believe, 8 beats per line. And then in Tibetan, this was usually translated either into 7 beats or 9 beats per line. But in English, I've chosen to translate based on the example of Geshe Graham Woodhouse, who I think had a very good idea to translate Tibetan text into English, into iambic system. Because as any of you know who know poetry will know that English poetry, basically since Chaucer in the 13th century, has almost exclusively been written, if it's in verse, is written in iambic system, which means that the second syllable is stressed. And iam means a foot. So there's 4 feet in iambic tetrameter, which this text is. There's 4 feet per line, meaning 8 syllables. And then it's pronounced with the second syllable usually being stressed. So I'll try to read that in that way so you can get an idea, but you can see that all the verses will all be in meter, so they can be read a certain way. And that's very helpful, I think, for memorizing and also just for making a kind of a visceral impression on the mind. And I've translated this mainly based on Gyaltsabje's commentary in terms of understanding the meaning, because he gets a very good exposition. And in certain cases, I borrowed from Geshe Thupten Jinpa's very excellent previous translation of the same text. So first we have the expression of homage. This is how we often open a text. Who taught this means to jettison, production and destruction both, dependent relative arising, I prostrate to the sovereign sage. So here we have Nagarjuna prostrating to the Buddha. And so there's a question that arises, because if any of you remember in the last text, text in 70 stanzas, there was no homage at the beginning of the text. So the question is, why is there homage in this text? But in 70 stanzas, and also in finally woven, there is no homage. And the reason is that, and also in the other text, Dispelling Disputes also does not have homage. The understanding is that those texts are digressions from root wisdom. So they are not separate texts, whereas the 60 stanzas is the standalone text. It's talking about the mind realizing emptiness. So it doesn't explicitly digress from any point within root wisdom. So it's a separate text, so it has its own expression of homage to the Buddha. And this is a bit ambiguous. It's said in the Sanskrit as well as in the Tibetan, which I can't recreate in English. This word who could have 4 different meanings. It's that basically this who is referring to the Buddha, the sovereign sage in the last line. But it could also mean that he taught the means to jettison. It could also mean he was the one who jettisoned or abandoned. It could also mean that through teaching this, he abandoned them. There's a lot of different ways to understand this, but basically the point is that the Buddha taught dependent arising. And through this means of the understanding dependent arising, we can jettison destruction and production, which means either we can cease to be born in samsara, to be born and experience death, or also that we can understand emptiness because we no longer attach to things as inherently produced and inherently destroyed. So this sovereign sage, see the understanding here, when we say sage, it means a realized being. But the Buddha is the supreme among the sages. He's the sovereign sage, Munindra in Sanskrit, the lord of the sages, the greatest sage. So now I've divided this text into 6 sections based on Gyaltsabje's own divisions. So you first have the teaching that dependent origination is free of extremes. So we start, those who realize this, free of extremes. So these, again, all of these headings that I have are based on Gyaltsabje's insertions in his commentary. So verse 1, whose intellect has passed beyond non-being and being and don't abide. These wise ones know conditions truth, profound and non-objectified. So what he's saying here is that the ones who realize the truth are freed from samsara. And he gives the example, or Chandrakirti actually gives the example in his commentary to this text of Shariputra, the Buddha's greatest disciple within the Pali Sutras. It's understood that Shariputra had realized emptiness because his intellect, his mind, had passed beyond being and non-being, without the extremes of things existing inherently or being totally non-existent. Or this could be understood without the extremes of thinking that samsara, which is being, is a real thing. And therefore I need to escape this real thing to achieve non-being, which would be nirvana without remainder. So somebody that once existed then ceases to exist. And they don't abide could also mean they don't abide in the middle between being and non-being. They don't abide attached to an inherently existent middle. It could also mean that they don't abide in holding things to be inherently existent. And so this stanza, it said that somebody could object to the verse of homage when it says that things are not born, because the Buddha taught about dependent arising. He said everything is born for the cause. So wouldn't it be like saying the unborn child is born? How can you say things are both born and aren't born? But here they know conditions truth, these wise ones. So the conditions truth, meaning the truth of dependent arising, that things do, because they are dependently arisen, they're empty of inherent existence. This is the truth of conditions. It's actually not contradictory to say that they are conventionally born, but inherently unborn. It's profound and non-objectified, meaning that when it's analyzed with wisdom, it can't be found. It can't be located among species of designation. And it's considered profound because it's difficult to realize and it's frightening to beings who don't understand it. To hear that things don't exist inherently is frightening. it's not observed and not objectified means that a mind holding to extremes cannot grasp it. It can only be grasped by a mind that breaks beyond the extremes of existence and non-existence. So it's understood that Sariputra, if any of you know the story of Sariputra, he was wandering one day. He was searching for a teacher, and he met Ashvajit, who was a student of the Buddha, and he was impressed by this person's demeanor. Asked him, "Who do you follow?" And he replied to him, "I follow the teacher who taught that all things arise from a cause." And thereby, when the cause ceases, then the things will cease to arise. This is talking about dependent arising. And upon hearing this, Sariputra had a realization of emptiness. So it's understood that he had extraordinary imprints, and it only required a slight push for him to grasp things as they are. Now, in his commentary on this verse, Chandrakirti asks the question, Gyaltsabje asks, because there are some people who think that when we talk about non-objectified, that it means that when somebody realizes emptiness, there's no longer any mind. That we say the mind realizing emptiness, or the non-dual mind, is merely a label. It's not actually a mind. That mind dissolves into emptiness like water dissolves into water. But in the Gaelic position, this is considered too extreme. So Gyaltsabje counters, this is how we debate things. He says, well, if we say non-dual mind, if the word mind is just not to be meant to be taken literally, then why don't we just say dualistic mind? Because we could just say dualistic is not meant to be taken literally either, and it just means non-dual. But we say non-dual mind. So obviously the first word, non-dual, is meant to be taken literally, so why don't we take the second word literally, mind? There is a mind that's non-dual. Now, when things are pacified, means that the grasping to extremes is pacified, but it doesn't mean that the mind stops to exist. He says it's similar to the example of somebody who has an eye disease and they see falling hairs. This is often an example that's used. Because of their disease, the cataracts, they have the vision of falling hairs. When their disease is cured, they no longer see the hairs. But the curing the disease doesn't mean they no longer have eyesight. It should be the opposite. It improves their eyesight. So likewise, when somebody is free of obscuration, their mind doesn't disappear. It's that the mind is no longer obscured. So now we have the second verse, committing to teach the profound, meaning that Nagarjuna is now making the promise that I will teach this text about the profound. So he says, first, nihilism, source of all, false has been disproved before. Now listen to the reasoning disproving absolutism. So he's saying that nihilism is the source of all faults. If we have the view that there's no cause and effect, this will be the cause of our engaging in negative actions, because we don't consider the effects of our actions. And this has been disproved before, meaning that in the Hinayana Sutras, the Buddha disproved this. He said that cause and effect functions. But now, let's go deeper and listen to the reasoning disproving absolutism. Things don't exist things don't not exist at all, but they also don't have the other extreme of existing inherently. Now, this could make it sound as though he's saying that emptiness was not taught in the Hinayana Sutras. But Chandrakirti clarifies this, that it's meant that although it was taught, it was not taught clearly or laid out in one place or taught extensively. So Nagarjuna is now going to teach it more extensively, make it more clear. So we have what's called the relevant consequence, meaning that in this case, now Nagarjuna is giving a consequence. So the consequence means that if you accept this is true, then this must follow. So there are people who say that in the Hinayana Sutras, the Buddha did not teach emptiness. And therefore, things do inherently exist. Now Nagarjuna is saying, if that's the case, if just as immature ones did imagine things, then all things were true. What reason for you not to grant they're liberated in non-thing? So he's saying that if the way things appear to us is the way they exist, because that's what we would have to say. If we say things are empty and inherent existence, we say they appear to us as inherently existent, that's just how they are, then why are we not all enlightened? Because we already see the truth. The purpose of the Buddha's teachings is to get us beyond our false appearance and see the truth behind those false appearances. But if everything existed just as it appears to us already, then why are we not all already liberated? And he says in non-thing, because he's pointing out that in this Hinayana system of tenets, there's an understanding that what we call nirvana is a liberation into a non-existence, that one who achieves non-abiding nirvana, one who achieves remainderless nirvana, that their aggregates cease and they no longer exist. So this is what he considers a nihilistic view. But if you accept this as what nirvana is, why are we all already in achieving nirvana? Because we already see the truth. And he gives the example of this baby. A child looks at a mirror and it's mistaken. It thinks it's another baby. We all have an appearance of things and we take that to be the truth, but it's not the way things exist. If it was the way things exist, then we would just see things as they are already, and we would be free. There would be no need for the Buddha to teach anything. So I noticed somebody asked who was the person Sariputra spoke to. I said it's Ashvajit, which is Tadu in Tibetan. So this word means subdues horses. I'm not sure why he got that name, but he was a student of the Buddha, and he just happened to be on the road begging, and Shariputra mentioned him, and met with him, and asked him who his teacher was. Okay. So now, verse 4. Only realizing non-duality can bring liberation. This is probably the most important verse of the text, actually. This is considered the heart of Nagarjuna saying very clearly, in order to achieve liberation, you have to realize emptiness. And that even the Hinayana practitioners do that. So he says, existence doesn't make one free. Non-being cannot transcend this world. By knowing both non-being and being completely, great ones find release. So he's saying there's two extremes, and you see this picture of the path going between the two extremes on either side. Existence is the extreme of thinking that things exist inherently. And with this view, we cannot be free. But also non-being cannot transcend this world, meaning thinking things don't exist at all, we won't be free. By knowing both non-being and being completely means to know that they don't exist inherently. The concept of being, existence, depends on the concept of non-existence. They exist in mutual relation. Neither of them exists from its own side, independent of the other one. It's like the mountain in the east and the mountain in the west. The mountain in the east is only east in relation to the mountain in the west. There's no inherent east and no inherent west. And likewise, there's nothing that inherently is existing, not in a relation to something else not existing. But knowing that these things do not exist in this way, that itself is how the great ones, meaning the Arya beings, find a release. So next, in his commentary to this text, Gyaltsab, he then cites a couple of verses from Nagarjuna's precious Garland, which are related to the same point. He says, like that, though it's like a mirage, to say this world exists or not, this apprehension is confused. Confusion doesn't liberate. The nihilists go to bad realms. Absolutists go to bliss. Those who know things as they are, not as those two, will liberate. So like that, because this is a text by Nagarjuna. In the previous verse, he has been talking about how people who see a mirage, might be confused that it's water. But then somebody else might go to the other extreme and say the water disappeared. There was water before, now it's gone when the mirage no longer appears. But that's also confused because there was no water in the first place. There was no water to stop existing. So people might say this world exists or it doesn't exist or it ceased to exist. But this is a confused apprehension. This doesn't bring liberation. The nihilists go to bad realms, meaning people who think that things don't exist, there's no cause and effect, they go to negative realms. And the ones who think things exist inherently, but if they think that there's inherent good and bad, they practice good, they do good things, they practice virtue, they will go to bliss. But in Buddhism, bliss is still not freedom, because it's still within cyclic existence. They still will die from that birth and eventually be born somewhere else. But those who know these things as they are, not as either inherently existent or non-existent, these ones will be free. They will liberate from samsara. So next we have verse 5. Scripture cannot establish the two extremes. So somebody objects that, okay, you said that things do not exist inherently. There's no existent being and non-being. But didn't the Buddha himself say that? He said there's samsara and nirvana. There's these two extremes. We want to achieve nirvana. We want to be free of samsara. So we can use the scripture to establish what we want to prove. But Nagarjuna responds, not seeing suchness, one conceives nirvana and samsaric worlds. By seeing suchness, no conceit, nirvana or samsaric worlds. So the point here is that we have to be very careful when we talk about samsara and nirvana. If we think of it as I'm in samsara now and I'm going to go to nirvana in the future, we already have a view of extremes. And this will actually prevent us from achieving nirvana. This theme will come up again and again in this text. So from the perspective of ordinary beings, in order to have them develop enthusiasm for spiritual practice, the Buddha talked about it as if these are different things. There's samsara, and then you need to achieve nirvana. But the ones who have actually realized it no longer see it that way. So somebody might object here that, well, how are these called the truths for Arya beings when Aryas don't see them this way? Chandrakirti asked this question. But he says that it's truth for an Arya being in the sense in two ways. One, that by contemplating the Four Noble Truths, which divide between the first two truths, samsaric truths, and the latter two truths, which free us from samsara, it leads us to become Aryas. But when somebody actually has the direct realization of emptiness, they no longer have the appearance of the four truths to their consciousness realizing emptiness. They realize them both as equally, all four truths are empty of inherent existence. But these truths lead us to that. And likewise, they're truths for Aryas because they're how Aryas see the world. In that Aryas recognize that ordinary beings create suffering for themselves conventionally, even though ultimately, as we see on this picture on the left, it's like one cannot exist without the other. They're simply reflections of each other. If we grasp to them as inherently real, we just circle around and again in samsara. So he's saying that the Chandrakirti says here that just because something exists for a mistaken perception doesn't necessarily mean it exists. So for our current perception, we have to think, I'm going to achieve enlightenment. If we don't have that conception, we're not going to make any effort to get there. But if we get attached too strongly to that, as I'm going somewhere else, then that eventually can become an obstacle. So we have to be careful when we analyze the ultimate. So next we have nirvana in our system. If he says that nirvana is not this thing that the Hinayanist consider it to be, then what is it? So he says, existence and nirvana's peace do not exist as separate things. To know existence thoroughly is what we call nirvana's peace. Just as a thing arises, then disintegrates, we call this ceased, just so the great ones understand cessation as illusion-like. So first he says that they don't exist as separate things. We can't pinpoint here is samsara and here is nirvana and point them out separately. Nirvana is thoroughly knowing existence meaning samsaric existence. So it's we can't escape samsara. The only thing we can do is understand it. The understanding of that self is nirvana. It's not that we leave existence, but that we examine it for what it is and we see it for what it is. This is called nirvana's peace. Likewise, now when a thing arises and disintegrates, we call that it ceased. So there's a few ways to understand this verse, but one way is that in the Hinayana tenets, they understand that nirvana is something that first arises, the contaminated aggregates are body and mind that are suffering, and then they cease to exist. That's nirvana. But the great ones understand it as the cessation of an illusion. When we talk about an illusion, it's not as though we can say, this illusion was here yesterday. So for example, we have an illusion of a horse. We'll come to this in a later stanza. We can't ask, when was this horse born and when will it die? Because it was only an illusion. So it never dies. But at the same time, when we understand it's like an illusion, we realize it doesn't exist in the first place. So there's no need for it to die, to not exist. So likewise with samsara, if we think of it as something that once was there and then later will cease, it becomes an extreme view. But if we understand this as like an illusion, then there's no question. It's like I said before, Nagarjuna is saying when the Buddha taught extinction in the Hinayana Sutras, he wasn't talking about something that once was there that then ceases to exist. He was talking about its very nature, by and of itself. It's inherent. It's called extinction of inherence. It's already lacking inherent existence. So then somebody asks, if nirvana is totally non-existent, then how do Aryas achieve something that doesn't exist? But then he replies that thoroughly knowing that existence is empty is nirvana. So conventionally, they achieve it. Conventionally, we can talk about this person was, I mentioned Acharya Moon in the introduction, this arhat from Thailand. Conventionally, as a young man, he was not an arhat. When he got older, he achieved arhatship. He achieved liberation. Conventionally, from our ordinary worldly perspective, that's the case. But from a deeper perspective, from his own perspective as an arhat, there's no longer a conception of a person who once existed that no longer exists as a samsaric being. It's only a worldly convention. But from the perspective of this person who's now realized emptiness, the question of time between past and future, they're only things that exist in relation to each other or exist in relation to a particular person experiencing it in a certain way. So in this next verse, in verse 7, Charandikirti says, it's like we talk about impermanence. So when we talk about impermanence, it can only exist in a relation to something that is impermanent. We have, for example, a pot, is the example that's often given, a vase or a pot, it's changing moment to moment. That moment to moment change is itself impermanent. There's no impermanence that exists separate from the pot. Likewise with emptiness, it's not something that exists separately. And when we talk about nirvana, nirvana is essentially a kind of emptiness. It's not something that we can point out separately from samsara. In some sense, it's like samsara viewed from a different perspective. When we see it in a broader view, it's naturally nirvana. It's not something other than that we don't have now. We need to go and find or go to that place. Okay, so now we have verse 8. Nirvana is not feasible in other systems. So Nagarjuna is saying that if you accept things as inherently existent, and if you accept that, as the Hinayana teachers do, as the texts do, that there is these inherently existent aggregates, that somebody then realizes Four Noble Truths, and the aggregates then cease, and they achieve remainless nirvana, then this doesn't make any sense. So first we have destruction brings cessation, not to know conditionality. So this is actually considered a consequence. It's saying that according to your system, you Hinayana sutras, I shouldn't say, but you Hinayana philosophers, then it's not knowing the way things exist, but simply the destruction of the aggregates. The aggregates ceasing their continuum. This is cessation of suffering. But then he gives two consequences. He says, first, to whom is this thing manifest? So this is the consequence of what we call remainderless nirvana. So I'll just step back, because some of you might know this term. In the Hinayana Sutras, it's talked about nirvana with and or without remainder. Somebody who realizes, our hardship, who becomes liberated, but still they exist in the physical body, they still have the remainder of that body. When they die, that body ceases and they have remainderless nirvana. They're no longer reborn. They no longer have any thing left over. But if this is what's meant by remainderless nirvana, then to whom is this thing manifest? The aggregates have ceased. There's no more person. So who achieves anything? If liberation is simply the extinction of my being, then who achieves anything? What is there for any? When the person is there, there's nothing to achieve. When the thing is achieved, the person is gone. So he considers this as an absurd consequence of their system. And likewise, this is how could destruction come to be? Is saying with remainder of nirvana, when this person destroys suffering. But if suffering is inherently existent, how could it ever cease to exist? Because it doesn't exist independent of anything else. And if it doesn't exist independent on something else, then there's nothing that you can destroy that will cause it to stop existing, because it doesn't depend on anything. Something, for example, if I have placed something on a table, the table supports it. If I break the table, the glass that I put on the table will then fall because it's supported by the table. But if it doesn't require a table to support it, even if I break the table, the glass will still just be floating there in midair because it doesn't depend on anything else. But if it depends on something else, then I can destroy the thing on which it depends, and thereby it will also cease to be. So here he's giving consequences of this system of inherent existence, saying that within your system, there cannot be nirvana. Nirvana cannot be the destruction of inherently existent aggregates. So in this system, it's understood that nirvana with remainder or nirvana without remainder, it's not to do with whether there is still this psychophysical aggregates or not. It has to do with the perspective of the person meditating, that's all. When an Arya or an Arhat, and liberated being, is absorbed in direct perception of emptiness, that is remainderless nirvana, because there's no longer any appearance of inherent things. When this person is in post-meditation, when they're no longer in meditative equipoise, then there's the appearance of real phenomena again. So this is remainder, because there's still some appearance to the consciousness of inherent things. But it's nothing to do with whether they exist or not. It's just a matter of what appears to consciousness and what doesn't appear to consciousness. So next he says, there is no nirvana without realizing emptiness. This is verse 9. If aggregates don't cease, then though afflictions die, you won't transcend. However, when they come to cease, at that time, liberation comes. So he's saying that if you have the view, as these Hinayana these Hinayana philosophies do, that you can achieve liberation not by realizing emptiness of the aggregates, but simply through extinction of afflictions, he's saying you won't transcend, saying that actually this is not liberation. You might think you're liberated, but you haven't achieved a real liberation. You think that you no longer have afflictions in your mind, but as long as you think that your aggregates are real and you think that you exist in an inherent way, you haven't actually achieved liberation. You still have the seed of that, because the seed of that is the conception of inherent existence. That conception itself will lead to afflictions arising again in the future, even if you might contemporarily not experience them arising. However, when they come to cease, when aggregates come to cease, and again, cease does not mean that they stop existing. It means that you no longer conceive of them as inherently existing. At that time, liberation comes. And likewise, we have in the precious Garland by Nagarjuna, as long as one grasps aggregates, till then one also grasps that I. When I is grasped, then karma too. From karma then again is birth. So he's saying that as long as you conceive of your aggregates as inherently existing, then eventually you're going to have the view of a self as inherently existing, even though you might think that you've realized selflessness. And when you have the view of the self as inherently existing, then you'll create karma based on that conception. And then from that karma, you'll experience birth. So until you realize the emptiness of the aggregates, then there will not be any way to be free of samsara. Okay, so next, verse 10. Arya's equipoise does not observe compounded things. So this comes to the question of when we have somebody in the sutras who seems to be achieving a realization of emptiness, then what are they actually experiencing? So are they experiencing the Four Noble Truths, which is what is presented in a lot of philosophical systems, that this person directly sees the suffering nature of existence? Or are they merely experiencing a non-conceptual appearance of no inherent existence? So he's saying here that if you understand it to be that the wisdom I perceives compounded things, which means perceives the suffering nature of existence, then you're still conceiving that to be the ultimate truth. The Arya's equipoise, meaning the noble beings who see the truth directly, what they're seeing should be what ultimately exists, the ultimate truth about things. But so if it observed the suffering nature of things, then the suffering nature of things should be their ultimate truth. So then this becomes a problem, because if it's like then the suffering itself would be inherently existent, and it comes to the problem before of then how can something that exists inherently ever come to cease? So when perfect wisdom looks and sees that ignorance conditions birth, then nothing is objectified as born or having ceased to be. So it's seeing the dependent relation between ignorance, the first link of dependent of the 12 links, and birth, which is the 11th link. We see that birth and ignorance depend on each other. So it doesn't objectify either of them. It doesn't say that ignorance is real or birth is real. They exist independent on each other, but ultimately neither of them can be found. And so there is nothing observed as either having been born or ceased to be, ultimately. And so the mind's wisdom I actually observes what you call the non-affirming negation. So this is a major point of debate between the Madhyamaka school and then the lower schools about whether it's possible to abide in this non-conceptual state, which is a direct perception of a mere negation. And the lower schools say that it's not. They would say that when somebody achieves the path of the Arya, the direct perception of reality, they are actually having the appearance to their mind of the psychophysical aggregates, and they're implicitly understanding these aggregates to exist in a particular way. But they can't have that in any appearance to their mind of an emptiness without the basis of emptiness, without something appearing as a basis for it. So this is quite a difficult concept, I think. So somebody then argues back to him here. Somebody says, if Aryas don't see things as existing, then that means they don't exist at all. But Chandrakirti says that in his commentary, there's a distinction here. An Arya being does not see things as existent in equipoise. That's different than seeing them as non-existent. So it's like saying, he gives the example, you can't say that this view of because fools don't understand it, right? So it's inequitable. It depends on the perspective of the consciousness. So it's a very subtle thing, but the understanding is that things don't exist inherently. And when somebody looks and sees their ultimate nature, they do not see them existing in an inherent way. But this does not exist. This does not negate that conventionally things function. Because some people understand the Madhyamaka view to be that it's saying that there is no view, that we just have no position whatsoever. We don't accept anything. But Charandakirti says this is a misunderstanding. We just as we might say that the mind-only school has no view, and the mind-only school would say we do have a view because we say that mind exists. And likewise in Madhyamaka, we say, well, we do have a view. We say that dependent arising exists, but everything exists in dependence on everything else. So you can't pinpoint any one thing as being existent in and of itself. So next we have the work has been done. This is a quote that's often given in the Hinayana Sutras. When somebody achieves arhatship, they will exclaim, I've done the work that has been done. I will no longer experience birth. So Nagarjuna says, that is in this life passing from all sorrow and all work's been done. So he's saying that merely recognizing that nothing exists inherently is in and of itself the work having been done. If we conceive some kind of inherent work that we have to do to achieve liberation, and that we're going to get to an inherent place where that work has been done, then we can't do the work, because the work itself is to simply recognize that things don't exist inherently. And on the left, this is a picture of an arhat. This is a common depiction of the arhats practicing very austerely, the students of the Buddha, meditating in a very intensive way. So dharmata does not have divisions. And what this means, dharmata is a synonym for emptiness. This is the truth of reality. So again, this is attacking the Hinayana philosophy, which says that when somebody realizes the truth, they sequentially go through the Four Noble Truths. If somebody has read some of these Hinayana expositions, you might have seen this idea, that somebody realizes the truth, and they divide the Four Noble Truths, each having 4 qualifications. So the first truth, the suffering, is impermanent, suffering, empty, and selfless. And then in one meditative session, the person then goes through these 16 characteristics, one at a time, sequentially, which implies that the ultimate truth is manifold, that there's all these different things that somebody sees. And Nagarjuna is rejecting that. He says when somebody sees ultimate truth, they simply see one thing. They see emptiness. That does not have any divisions of the emptiness of one thing versus the emptiness of the other. The emptiness of the truth of suffering is exactly the same as the emptiness of the truth of cessation. One is not more real than the other. So he says, if at the Dharma knowledge's end, so Dharma knowledge is actually one of the stages, the 16 stages that we talk about. This had particularities. So if at the end of the first stage, then somebody moved to the second stage of these 16 stages, and they observed something else, if it had particularities at each one, the one would posit birth upon this very subtle thing as well. So this very subtle thing means the ultimate truth. It would mean that you're positing that there's some kind of division within that. These ones who fail to understand don't see conditioned birth's import. So the people who fail to understand that the ultimate truth of things, which is that they are empty of inherent existence, then they fail to see that conditioned arising is itself indicating that things do not have inherent existence. So next we have verse 13 to 14. The work has not been done, saying that actually, if you have this idea that things exist inherently, then you haven't done the work. If you think I'm meditating, now I achieved liberation, now I'm free, then it's exactly the opposite, because you're still conceiving a self who had afflictions and no longer has afflictions. When a monk exhausts afflictions, if samsara thereby ends, why haven't perfect Buddhas then explained it has a starting point. If there's a start, then certainly that's clinging. It becomes a view. So here he's saying that if there was a samsara that once was there and then ended, then it should have had a starting point too, because the end of something can only exist in relation to the beginning of something else. But the Buddha never talked about the beginning of samsara. So how could it have an end? Now, this is a difficult point because we might argue, well, we know that when we talk about practice, we say that samsara is beginningless, but eventually we can have an end of samsara. Now, conventionally, that's the case, yes. Conventionally, from our ordinary worldly perspective, we can talk about this person who, as a young man or a young woman, was not liberated. And when they became older, they achieved liberation. It ended. That's from our perspective. But from their perspective, we say it's like a dream. If you wake up from a dream, do you say that, there was that time when I was trapped in the jail, and if I was dreaming I was trapped in the jail, I would say I was trapped in a jail, and now I'm free of the jail? Or would you say that I just woke up and there was no jail to begin with? There was never anything. It was all just a dream. So we can't say that the jail, I was first put in jail and then I was released. If we have that view, then it becomes a view. It becomes a clinging to something inherent. So it has no end and no beginning. We have here dependent relative arising. How can this start? How can it end? What's born before, how later could it once again reverse itself? So first we have on the left here, the big crunch theory. I think this is a nice analogy here. We have in science, we have the idea of the Big Bang. But a lot of scientists would argue that there has to also be a big crunch, that things expand and they contract. But there isn't just one inherent beginning and one inherent end. It's just a process of things circling, which very much fits in with the Buddhist view. And then on the right here, we have, I couldn't help but put this in because those of us who grew up in the 90s, when we hear the term no end and no beginning, we're immediately reminded of this music video by Madonna, the pop artist. But actually, it's an interesting point here. She is locked in a jail, and she says, it's like a dream, no end and no beginning. So I think this is exactly what we're talking about here. That if we think I'm in jail and I need to get out of this jail, and we search for all these ways to get out of the jail, if we're only dreaming we're in jail, whenever it doesn't matter how much, how many different passages we go through in the jail. What we have to do is wake up from the dream, not think that once upon a time I was here and now I'm going to go there. It's just a matter of changing our state of consciousness. So he illustrates this with the example of an illusion. And I mentioned before, I'll come to this here, the illusion of the horses. Free of extremes, after, before, migrators like illusions dance. Reflecting an illusion formed, reflecting now it's disappeared. Illusion knowers aren't confused. Unknowers wholly crave for them. So here we have people who know things are an illusion. They say it's an illusion formed and now it disappeared. They don't ask, when did we see this horse in the right? You might notice this is an illusion of a horse. If you know this is an illusion, you wouldn't say, when was this horse born and when is it going to die? Because you know it's just an illusion. But the people who don't know it, then they crave for them. They see objects that they think are real and then they have attachment to them or aversion to them, depending on their perspective of them. And then they ask the question, where did this come from? Where is it going? So I think it's about 3:35 now. We've gotten through 16 verses, so I think that's good. The first part of this text is really actually the hardest part. So the other parts will go a little more smoothly, and we can discuss things more. But I want to, it's because I mentioned we have to finish by 3:45 today, just because Venerable Namjung has to teach at 4 from the same room. So let's, there's a few questions now. So let me look at some of the questions that might all be here. Could you repeat the last couple of sentences? So I think if you were talking about what I just said, I was saying that we have the illusion. And then there's a question of, if we have an illusion, so imagine we have a dream. A dream is a good example of we're having a nightmare. If you're having a nightmare, it doesn't help really in an ultimate sense, to try to solve the problem that you're having in the dream. The only solution is to wake up from the dream. So likewise, if we conceive of samsara and we conceive that I'm in this bad state now and I need to go to a better place, conventionally, we do actually need to think that way. We need to make effort in the path. It's a bit of a paradox. If we don't think that way, then we'll just be lazy. I mentioned in the introduction about Hakuun, the Japanese practitioner who criticized these do-nothing Zen practitioners in Japan, who just said, don't do anything, you're already liberated. You have to make a lot of effort. But that if you have that effort with a strong view of, I'm an inherent person going somewhere, then actually that becomes an obstacle. But if we have the understanding that actually this is a dream, it's not a matter of going anywhere. It's a matter of recognizing it for what it is. Then we no longer have a question of where did this come from, where is it going? Because it's not a thing to be as arose in the first place. It's just a construction of our mind. So could you please repeat the last stanza, 15? Okay, so 1 second. Yeah, so free of extremes, after, before, migrators like illusions dance. So this first part is just saying, without having the extreme of thinking things once, this was existed before, and this will exist later. It's just an illusion. The migrators mean sentient beings that migrate through the states of existence. Reflecting an illusion formed. Reflecting now it's disappeared. These are the people who see things as they are. Illusion knowers aren't confused. So they don't think, where did this come from? Where is it going? They know that it's just an illusion. But the unknowers, the ones who think that it's real, they wholly crave for them. They think that I want to have this, I don't want to have that, because they think all of it is real. They don't see it as a projection of their mind. In post-meditative equipoise, the perception of inherently existent things is remainder, where things appear without perceiving them as inherently existing. Yes, that's right. So again, we have the distinction between the Hinayana Arhat and the Buddha who's achieved full enlightenment. So for the Hinayana Arhat, when they're in meditative equipoise and emptiness, that's no remainder because they no longer have any appearance of inherent existence. But when they come out of that, then still to their sense consciousness, but based on the past imprints of conceiving inherent existence, then things do still appear as inherently existent. That's considered remainder. But ultimately, when somebody achieves Buddhahood, then they no longer have that appearance. So that even in post-meditative equipoise, well, actually, we say the Buddha does not have a distinction between meditation and non-meditation, that the mind is in a state of constant meditative equipoise, yet still perceives conventionalities. Conventionalities doesn't mean inherently existent, but it perceives it's still capable of functioning in the world, in the conventional world, while still in equipoise on seeing things as lacking inherent existence. Okay. So is emptiness also an illusion? Yes. This is what we call the emptiness of emptiness. It's said that that's also an extreme view. Before Tsongkhapa, I mentioned Lama Zopa Rinpoche talking about how before Tsongkhapa there was different wrong views. People didn't have the correct philosophical understanding of emptiness. And they generally fell into two camps. One was people who said that that emptiness is inherently real. But this was generally ascribed to the scholar Chapa Choki Senke, who was a 13th century Tibetan scholar, who said they basically confuse the idea because we say that when things are analyzed with ultimate analysis, they aren't located. But emptiness is what is perceived by that ultimate analysis. So he then took it to mean that therefore emptiness is found under ultimate analysis because it's what's the object of perception of this ultimate analysis, and thereby it must exist inherently. But what Tsongkhapa clarified is that, for example, if we analyze the nature of a particular thing, like a vase, the ultimate nature of that vase is the vase's emptiness, which is found by that analysis. But then if we analyze emptiness itself, then we don't find that emptiness. We find the emptiness of that emptiness. So nothing, when it's examined, is actually found. The emptiness of that thing is found. But then when you turn and try to find that emptiness objectively, you also don't find it. So emptiness itself is empty and inherent existence. And the other extreme, which is attributed to the scholar Ngok Loden Sherap, who was also before Tsongkhapa, was that thereby, if emptiness, if anything found under ultimate analysis is not, it must be inherently existent, then thereby emptiness cannot also be found under ultimate analysis. And therefore emptiness is not an object of knowledge. It's not something we can perceive directly. It's only something we can talk about what it is not. But Tsongkhapa said that this is also an extreme view. And both of these people are misunderstanding the emptiness of emptiness. So in either case, it's either making emptiness into some kind of real thing that's greater than everything else, or it's saying that everything is contingent, and it's almost a form of nihilism, that there's nothing behind all of it. Whereas Tsongkhapa says there is an emptiness that we can perceive. But that emptiness itself, it's neither non-existent nor inherently existent. It's something that we have to search very carefully for and eventually have a direct experience of this. Okay, so it's 3:44. So we have to do some prayers. I forgot about that. We want to do the closing prayers, so we want to finish soon. So Shanti, do you have the closing prayers? We'll try to finish them quickly so that Venerable Namjung can get started. If anyone has any other questions today, please send them, and I can try to respond by email, or we can ask tomorrow. Or we'll have also plenty of time after the course. I can continue answering questions. So. May the precious supreme bodhicitta not yet born arise. May that arisen not decline, but increase more and more. Samsara and nirvana lack even atom and inherent existence, and cause and effect independent arising aren't betraying. I seek your blessings to discern the meaning of Nagarjuna's thought, that these two are mutually complementary, not contradictory. However many sick sentient beings there are, may they quickly be freed from all sicknesses. May all sicknesses without exception of transmigrating beings never occur again. In all my lives, never separated from perfect gurus, may I enjoy the magnificent Dharma. By completing the qualities of the grounds and paths, may I quickly attain the state of Vajradhara. By the force of the victorious one Tsongkhapa, acting as my direct Mahayana virtuous friend in all my lives, may I never turn away for even a second from the purest path highly admired by the victorious ones. May I and all sentient beings, may the teachings of the victorious Losandrakpa, who lived an eminent life of pure morality, a brave heart in doing the Bodhisattva's extensive deeds, and the yoga of the two stages, the supreme transcendental wisdom of non-blue bliss and voidness. Like the earth, water, fire, and wind, medicines, and wood in the forest, may I always be enjoyed by all sentient beings with their like and without resistance. May I hold sentient beings as dear as my life. May I hold sentient beings, may the sentient beings hold me most dear. May all their negative karma ripen on me and all my virtue ripen on them. As long as any sentient being is not liberated from samsara, may I abide in samsara to help them, even though I achieve highest enlightenment. May I become like a wish-granting jewel and fulfilling all the wishes of, and like a wish-granting tree, filling all the hopes of transmigratory beings. By merely seeing, hearing, thinking, or remembering me, as well as by touching or talking to me, may all suffering be instantly pacified, and may there be happiness forever. To all the past, present, and future merits collected by me, the numberless Buddhas, the numberless sentient beings, which are completely empty existing from their own side, may I, who am completely empty existing from my own side, achieve the state of full enlightenment, which is completely empty existing from its own side, and all sentient beings who are completely empty existing from their own side, that state which is completely empty existing from its own side, or myself alone, who is completely empty existing from my own side. I fully dedicate all these virtues to be able to train to Shukihira, Manjushri, and reality as it is, and like so the Madhyamaka as well. For they get all merits of virtue, that getting is praised the best by the victorious ones of 3 times that have good conduct. For the sake of the Dhamma's King Tsongkhapa, see the Dharma to flourish, may all signs of obstacles be pacified and all conditions be complete. Due to the two types of merit of 3 times of myself and others, may the teachings of the victorious one Losang Drapa shine resplendent forever. The wish granting wish of filling jewel, source of every benefit and happiness in this world, the incomparably kind, supreme Tenzin Gyatso. May you have a long life and all the holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bounty bearer for all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Madhyamaka's victorious doctrine, and massively accomplished magnificent prayers on the 3 divine ones. Savior, myself, and others, your disciples, please, please live long. Okay, thank you, everyone. So we have to finish now, so Venerable Longzhen can get started. So just remember, tomorrow we're going to have a bit of a modified schedule because of His Holiness's teaching. So we'll have 11 to 1 Indian time, and then 2:30 to 4:30 in the afternoon Indian time. And then again, as I said, if you have any other questions that I can't address here, Shanti, please contact Shanti and she can send to me. There might be a bit of delay in the response again, but it's because of the technical issues here. We're having some trouble with email access as well, but I will be certain to get your question at some point. So thank you all very much, and we'll see you tomorrow. Goodbye.